Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to listen to me talking about Faulkner and death on a Saturday night. So, who was William Faulkner? By way of a brief biographical introduction, Faulkner was born in 1897 in Mississippi, and he would go on to become one of the towering figures of 20th century literature, along with one of the icons of American fiction. He was the exact contemporary of modernists such as James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Virginia Woolf, along with American authors like Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway. His work has also often been read in the context of postmodernism, especially since the publication of his later novels such as Requiem for a Nun, A Fable, and The Reivers coincide with, for example, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch, and Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire. From 1925 until his death in 1962, Faulkner published 19 novels, most notably The Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, Sanctuary, Light in August, and Absalom, Absalom, along with dozens of short stories such as the canonical A Rose for Emily. Faulkner's novels are, with a few exceptions, set in Yoknapatawpha County, a fictionalized version of Lafayette County, Mississippi, where Faulkner lived for most of his life on his Roanoke estate. With Yoknapatawpha, Faulkner created what he called his little postage stamp of native soil, wherein he could tell the stories of a fictional series of families, such as the Sartorises, the Compsons, the Snopeses, to name only a few examples, and their struggle to negotiate the South's often agonistic transition from antebellum slavery to industrial modernity. His major novels would form the basis upon which he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950. In a letter written to his editor, Malcolm Cowley, in 1949, Faulkner made clear that his posthumous ambition as an author was to be, as a private individual, abolished and avoided from history, leaving it markless, no refuse save the printed books. Faulkner asserted that it is my aim and every effort bent that the sum and history of my life, which in the same sentence is my obit and epitaph too, shall be them both. He made the books and he died. In the foreword to the Faulkner Reader, which was published in 1954, Faulkner asserted that his primary aim in writing fiction was to uplift man's heart. Qualifying his statement, Faulkner added that this does not mean that we are trying to change man, improve him, though this is the hope, maybe even the intention of some of us. On the contrary, in its last analysis, this hope and desire to uplift man's heart is completely selfish, completely personal. He would uplift man's heart for his own benefit because in that way he can say no to death. Faulkner's declaration in the foreword was followed by a statement he made in an interview during his visit to Japan in 1955. In that interview, Faulkner elaborated upon his earlier sentiments, asserting that in no way can man attain harmony better than in the creation of something which will outlast him. Because when he passes through the wall of oblivion, he will leave on that wall, for a few years everywhere you saw Kilroy was here, well, that's what the artist has done. Faulkner contended that while the artist cannot live forever, a work of art, whether in the form of a picture, a poem, or otherwise, lasts a long time, a very long time, longer than anything. As these statements imply, Faulkner's preoccupations with mortality can be interpreted as his own deliberate authorial attempt to evade and deny his own death by achieving immortality through the lasting creation of literary art. For Faulkner, fiction was the means by which man will not merely endure, he will prevail, especially since the poet's voice can function as both the record of man and, more significantly, one of the props and pillars to help him endure and prevail. His utterances on these matters have subsequently led critics, most notably Robert W. Hamblin, to conclude that the key to Faulkner's theory of fiction is to be found in his statement, repeated many times after 1951, but implicit in even his earliest work, that writing was his way of saying no to death. Faulkner adopted this aesthetic of immortality, saying no to death, through writing from two of the most significant literary influences he encountered throughout his life, and particularly in the early phase of his career, William Shakespeare and John Keats. Shakespeare, Keats, and Faulkner were each acutely aware of the inevitable arrival of one's own mortality, and more importantly, the fundamental need for humanity to, in Shakespeare's words in the sonnets, make war upon this bloody tyrant time. Art to Faulkner became the means by which one could preserve life and extend one's mortality, thereby saying no to death. In practice, therefore, Faulkner was emulating one of the central thrusts of the early part of one of Shakespeare's best-known sonnets, Sonnet 18. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. As I hope my comments have made clear so far, the influence of Shakespeare upon Faulkner's work was incalculable. While at the University of Virginia in 1957, and in response to the question, do you enjoy reading Shakespeare? Faulkner stated, yes, I still read Shakespeare. I have a one-volume Shakespeare that I have just about worn out carrying around with me. In Faulkner biography, Joseph Blotner revealed that Faulkner could easily identify and quote reams of obscure Shakespeare sonnets from memory. On the close intersection between authorship and literary immortality, Faulkner himself acknowledged that the individual is not too much. He's only a pinch of dust. He won't be here very long anyway, but his species, his dreams, they go on. There's always somebody that will keep on creating art like Shakespeare as long as man keeps on producing. Alongside Shakespeare, Keats exerted a lifelong influence upon Faulkner's approach to his work. In 1925, Faulkner recounted that upon first reading Keats in his youth, he discovered a beautiful awareness that was so sure of its own power that it is not necessary to create the illusion of force by frenzy and motion. In his Odes to a Nightingale and on a Grecian Urn, Keats evinces a constant awareness of humanity's eventual end, while also advocating for the use of music and art as a way of transcending mortality. For example, he claims in his Ode to a Nightingale that the nightingale will never be affected by the weariness, the fever, or the fret of human life. Instead, the immortal bird is able to escape these mortal frets because it is immune to death. Therefore, the nightingale preserves its lustrous appearance, while human beauty cannot. Similarly, the Grecian urn survives to assert the claim that beauty is truth, truth beauty. Indeed, the urn encapsulates Faulkner's aesthetic quest as a novelist to arrest motion, which is life by artificial means, and hold it fixed so that 100 years later, when a stranger looks at it, it moves again. A statement which explicitly verbalizes his long-held obsession with literary immortality that I've outlined so far. As evidenced by Keats's musings upon the urn, though death cannot be stopped, and though old age shall this generation waste, humankind is able to leave behind a monument to itself through poetry and sculpture. The immortal piping songs of the melodist, which are emblazoned upon the urn, await the spectator, the reader, the poet, and the literary artist to make this fixed art move again. Much like Faulkner's invocation of his printed books in his letter to his editor, the urn to Keats serves as a self-renewing, self-perpetuating artifact, whose beauty is fixed and unchanging. In 1924, and under the influence of Keats, Faulkner wrote a poem called Mississippi Hills, My Epitaph, which he would later revise and publish as the 44th and final poem, If There Be Grief, Then Let It But Rain, in his 1933 collection, A Green Bough. That poem, as Faulkner's original title suggests, functions as his epitaph decades before his ultimate death in 1962. So, versions of this aesthetic of immortality are reflected in fiction published during the late 19th and early to mid-20th century, including many of Faulkner's major literary influences besides Shakespeare and Keats. I want to focus specifically and in detail here upon Joseph Conrad, whose Heart of Darkness was, according to Joseph Blotner, Faulkner's biographer, one of the finest stories Faulkner had ever read. In Conrad's novel, Mr. Kurtz is resurrected through Charlie Marlowe's recollections of the horrors of the civilizing mission. As with Ishmael's recollection of his experiences with Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick, Marlowe's story in Heart of Darkness functions in part as a lamentation over Kurtz's descent into the heart of an immense darkness. As I mentioned a moment ago, Faulkner's aesthetic quest as a novelist was to arrest motion, which is life, by artificial means and hold it fixed so that 100 years later, when a stranger looks at it, it moves again. This statement is directly comparable to, and I would even argue a deliberate rewriting of, Conrad's closing statement in his preface to his 1897 novel, The Narcissus, wherein Conrad tells us that his ambition as a novelist is to arrest, for the space of a breath, the hands busy about the work of the earth, and compel men entranced by the sight of distant goals to glance for a moment at the surrounding vision of form and color, of sunshine and shadows, to make them pause for a look, for a sigh, for a smile. Such is the aim, difficult and evanescent, and reserved only for a very few to achieve. But sometimes, by the deserving and the fortunate, even that task is accomplished. And when it is accomplished, behold, all the truth of life is there. A moment of vision, a sigh, a smile, and the return to an eternal rest. So the influence of Conrad's narratives upon Faulkner's life and work, along with the work of authors like Melville and Joyce, demonstrate the extent to which Faulkner was actively engaging in conversation with modern writers through his interconnected treatment of death and literary voice. A key feature of his work that is also paralleled in, for example, Moby Dick or Ulysses. Alongside the aesthetic tradition of immortality through art as exemplified by Shakespeare and Keats and later adopted by Faulkner, the socio-historical origins of saying no to death can be located in the early 20th century, as seen through the chaos and loss of life which resulted from World War I. In his essay, Timely Reflections on War and Death, published in 1915, Sigmund Freud outlined a transatlantic compulsion towards death denial that the Western world and artists like Faulkner were profoundly affected by at the time. Freud outlines the unmistakable tendency within modern society at the turn of the 20th century to push death aside, to eliminate it from life, and to keep it deadly silent. Our own death is indeed unimaginable, Freud continues, and however we may try to imagine it, we realize that we are actually present as onlookers. In the context of the high number of casualties of the war, however, Freud insists that death can no longer be denied. We are obliged to believe in it. People are really dying, not individually now, but in large numbers, often tens of thousands in a single day. Faulkner proclaimed himself to be ignorant of Freud's work. In 1958, when he was questioned on his views of psychology and its possible influence on his writing, Faulkner insisted that what little of psychology I know, the characters I have invented and playing poker have taught me. Freud I'm not really familiar with. However, despite his emphatic rejection of any knowledge of Freud's work, Faulkner's statement here was, you'll be surprised to know, was disingenuous. Because he actually had, in fact, previously gestured towards his familiarity with Freud in a 1922 essay called Books and Things, American Drama Inhibitions. In that essay, Faulkner complained that writing people are all so pathetically torn by a desire to make a figure in the world and a morbid interest in their personal egos, the deadly fruit of the grafting of Sigmund Freud upon the dynamic charms of a hodgepodge of nationalities. So Faulkner's caustic and quasi-analytic jibes against authorial egotism here notwithstanding, there are clear parallels, I think, that can be drawn between Freud's ruminations on the Western world and its attitudes towards death at the onset of World War I, and Faulkner's own representation of the South in the global aftermath of the Great War and the earlier national consequences of the Civil War. Those representations of the South in Faulkner's work are often inflected with an overwhelming sense of loss, decay, and destruction. And to whet your appetite for my longer, more specific account of Faulkner's aesthetics of mortality in my book, I want to focus briefly here upon Sutpens 100, the 64,000 acre slave plantation in Faulkner's masterwork, Absalom, Absalom, which is described as suffering from a desolation more profound than ruin because of the widespread devastation that riddled the South, by the end of the Civil War. And those descriptions of the plantation that I've just read, it being a desolation more profound than ruin, suggests that the ruin which befalls the plantation mirrors in a way the ravishment that the South itself had experienced throughout the war, and that Sutpen's and that Sutpen himself, the plantation owner, suffers from within Jefferson in the years thereafter. Freud's ideas are also widely reflected in the works of social anthropologists and historians, both in Europe and North America, in the mid to late 20th century, most notably by Jeffrey Gora, Philippe Ariès, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Gora likens the mention of death in the 20th century to the illicit consumption of pornography in the 19th century. He claims that the natural processes of corruption and decay have become so disgusting as the natural processes of birth and copulation were a century ago. Gora's conception of death in the 20th century is figured as a transgressive and outlandish topic, a fact of life that all human beings must experience, but which nonetheless has been relegated to the margins and interstices of polite society. Ariès, on the other hand, notes that one must avoid, no longer for the sake of the dying person, but for society's sake, for the sake of those close to the dying person, the disturbance and the overly strong and unbearable emotion caused by the ugliness of death and by the very presence of death in the midst of a happy life. Ariès makes clear the extent to which death was seen as anathema to the ideas of prosperity, longevity, and any sense of personal and emotional stability within one's life that were advocated throughout the 20th century. Likewise, Kubler-Ross outlines the impossible task of conceptualizing one's death, because in one's own conscious mind, we can only be killed because it is inconceivable to die of natural causes or of old age. Therefore, death itself is associated with a bad act, a frightening happening, something that in itself calls for retribution and punishment. Kubler-Ross makes Gora's universalist claims regarding the fear of death innately individual and personal. At the same time as she encapsulates those fears within the collective unconsciousness of modern society, her overarching argument echoes the stance that my book takes when reconceptualizing death and Faulkner's fiction, namely that we may achieve peace, our own inner peace as well as peace between nations, by facing and accepting the reality of our own death. Freud, Gora, Ariès, and Kubler-Ross each make clear that while death denial is a socially constructed phenomenon, it is also consciously engaged in and is in fact a fundamentally human endeavor. Nobody wants to die. Eventually, these insights and cultural trends in the denial of death led Jonathan Dollimore at the tail end of the 20th century to question conventional wisdom by illustrating the possible disingenuousness of death denial proponents. Dollimore writes, occasionally one wonders if the advocates for the death denial argument are not themselves in denial. They speak about death endlessly yet indirectly, analyzing not death so much as our culture's attitude towards it. To that extent, it is not the truth of death, but the truth of our culture they seek. Even as they make death signify in this direct way, it is still death that is compelling them to speak. Dollimore's stance allows us to circle right back to and directly confront the ways in which, up to now, death denial has been a central component in understanding mortality in Faulkner's fiction and in wider Faulkner scholarship. In his early influential attempt to explain the centrality of death in Faulkner's fiction, Hamblin argued that Faulkner was extremely apprehensive concerning death. Those fears, Hamblin writes, originated in early childhood and were likely linked to adolescent traumas such as Faulkner's brush with death from scarlet fever at age 4, or from the successive deaths of his beloved grandmothers when he was 9 years old. As is clear from the biographical sketch which Hamblin has provided here, concerns with mortality textured and informed Faulkner's life from his earliest days. According to Hamblin, Faulkner's childhood was marked by a heightened awareness concerning death. Indeed, so great were Faulkner's concerns with mortality that they drove him to cultivate what Hamblin describes as a fear of death as obliteration. That fear then went on to inform Faulkner's conception of the South in his major works as a region that was profoundly affected by the loss of its self-perceived glory during the Civil War, which my brief discussion of Absalom and Sapiens 100, I hope, made clear. A number of critics have subsequently commented upon and built upon Hamblin's arguments regarding the importance of death in Faulkner's narratives, while remaining in broad agreement with his hypothesis. Warwick Wadlington, for instance, typifies Faulkner's declaration in the foreword to the Faulkner Reader as a confrontation with mortality, which tests as it enacts the power to exist. More recently, Charles Regan Wilson has written that Faulkner's stories take place in a culture of death in which his characters confront death in all its ugliness and corruption. Wilson continues, if Faulkner graphically portrays death as a highly visible, inevitable, unpleasant occurrence, he still does not succumb to a dark fatalism of death. A major theme in his discussion of death and its relation to Southern culture is the centrality of a decorum of death, the need for ritual to preserve human continuity in the face of the terrors of death. Wilson further defines decorum in Faulkner's fiction as a proper funeral, tombstone, and burial ground, which he asserts are essential for a proper Faulknerian funeral. Each of the scholars that I've just highlighted, Hamblin, Wadlington, and Wilson, remain faithful to the idea of the denial of death in Faulkner's fiction, both in the 20th century world in general and throughout the United States in particular. Such scholarly attitudes reflect and perpetuate the ambivalence and fear that modern American society and modern society throughout the world holds towards death. In their refusal to overtly question or refute Faulkner's stance towards his work and the immortalizing functionality of art, Hamblin, Wadlington, and Wilson each ultimately reinforce rather than challenge these long-held and deeply entrenched cultural fears about human mortality. Building upon and challenging Hamblin's arguments, my monograph, William Faulkner and Mortality, A Fine Dead Sound, examines representations of mortality in a selection of Faulkner's fiction. Through close readings of 6 of his major works, The Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, A Rose for Emily, Light in August, Absalom, and Go Down Moses, my book adopts as its central line of inquiry the ways in which Faulkner's characters respond to and negotiate the traumas which death creates. More importantly, I make the case that this ambivalence towards death, which Faulkner's characters exhibit in these works, actually drives them towards fully accepting and saying yes to death. The overall purpose and overarching argument of my study, therefore, is to directly contradict and challenge Hamblin's view that Faulkner's characters, more often than not, are those individuals who, like the artist, say no to death, who choose life even when that choice entails a considerable amount of anxiety, guilt, or pain. In stark contrast to Hamblin's claims, my book explores those marginalized characters in Faulkner's fiction, namely Quentin Compson in The Sound and the Fury, Addie Bundren in As I Lay Dying, Emily Grierson in A Rose for Emily, Joe Christmas in Light in August, Wash Jones in Absalom, Anne Ryder and Butch Beauchamp in Go Down Moses, each of whom find themselves on the boundary between life and death and ultimately say yes. The marginalization that these characters suffer is manifested in numerous ways. For example, Emily Grierson's relations to the modern generation of her town, or the poverty and suffering that Addie Bundren experiences during her life with her husband and her 5 children, highlights the rigid gender dynamics and misogynistic social subordination, which is embedded into Faulkner's representation of Southern life. Likewise, Ryder in Go Down Moses suffers total anguish to the sudden death of his wife, Manny, which embodies the uncontrollable impulses which can arise from extreme grief and bereavement. These emotions are then combined in the story with the ubiquity of racism and white supremacist attitudes in Southern society. Also, Quentin Compson's unrequited incestuous longings for his younger sister, Caddy, along with his fraught relations with his own father and his preoccupations with the fall of the Old South, exemplify the socio-historical and familial pressures and obligations which contribute to his own unapologetic desire for death. In contrast to Faulkner's early novels like Soldier's Pay or the first novel set in Yoknapatawpha County, Flags in the Dust, that are explicitly reflective of Faulkner's own aesthetic concerns of mortality and his insistence upon saying no to death. The characters that I examine within my book, in his major works, use speech to actively consider and respond to the suffering that they have endured throughout their lives. Having been placed in these dehumanizing and neglected social positions, they choose to say no to death. They choose to say yes to death, sorry. By doing so, they are not only afforded a chance to tell their stories, but they also find relief from the pain and suffering which has characterized their lives. Accordingly, the opening of the book is concerned with the first-person voice of Quentin Compson in The Sound and the Fury, as he stands on the threshold between life and death and expresses an all-encompassing need to die. As he readies himself for suicide by drowning throughout June 2nd, 1910, Quentin speaks of himself as always already dead. He never deviates from his plan to enact what critic Charles Chappell has described as his ardently desired death. At the same time, however, while Quentin unquestionably desires death, he never acknowledges his impending suicide directly, nor indeed does he ever utter the word suicide during that chapter. The reason for that evasion, as my work makes clear, is because Quentin's speech is saturated with Southern society's prejudices and hostilities towards suicide. In chapter 2, I shift from Quentin to the voice of Addie Bundren in As I Lay Dying, who offers a posthumous first-person account of her life. Her speech explains why her existence was, in effect, a long-held preparation for her inevitable death. Her single chapter at the center of the novel acts as her own explicit final judgment against the words of her father, the demands of her family, and the suffocating pressures of her community, all of which caused her life to function as an unrelenting figuration of death. Then in chapter 3, I move on to an analysis of the conflict between the two distinct opposing generations within Faulkner's canonical short story, A Rose for Emily. The industrializing modern South, as represented by the story's anonymous narrator, and the old, moribund, and decayed antebellum aristocracy, as embodied by Emily and her milieu. The new generation demands supremacy over the modern space of the South in the decades following the Civil War, in order to vanquish the disgraced monuments of the dead Southern past. During his account of Emily's life and times, the anonymous narrator attempts to justify why such a vanquishing must take place. By doing so, he effectively transforms Emily's voice into a dead sound which speaks the resistance of her generation. Chapter 4 reads two of the most infamous murders in Faulkner's oeuvre in conjunction with one another: Percy Grimm's murder of Joe Christmas in Light in August, and Wash Jones's murder of Thomas Sutpen in Absalom, Absalom. In Light in August, Joe places himself upon the boundary between life and death after murdering his lover, Joanna Burden. In other words, Joanna's death serves as a suicidal gesture on Joe's part, a call for an end to his life of abjection and alienation. He ultimately says yes to death by surrendering himself to vigilante justice at Percy Grimm's hands. Grimm, who works under a perverse code of racial purity and an insistence upon white supremacy, aims to protect white womanhood against the mythical threat and menace of what historians and critics such as Angela Davis, Joel Williamson, and Andrew Leiter have each described as the Black Beast rapist in American society. In Absalom, Absalom, meanwhile, Thomas Sutpen is justifiably murdered after he breaks the conditions upon which Wash Jones exchanges his granddaughter Millie, and more specifically her reproductive rights, with Sutpen in return for recognition of Wash's fierce loyalty and servitude over a 20-year period. Sutpen's revocation of this exchange on the day that his daughter with Millie is born causes the designs of both himself and Wash Jones to fail. Each man is ultimately left with nothing to live for. My book concludes with an exploration of Faulkner's use of third-person distance voice in two stories from the final work of his major phase, Go Down Moses, Pantaloon in Black, and the titular short story, Go Down Moses. Outlining the distance which Faulkner places between himself as a white Southern writer, his white readership, and the African Americans in these stories who are unable to express their mourning and grief in their own words, I argue that throughout Faulkner's oeuvre, sorrow and bereavement is consistently filtered through a white authorial lens, and especially in Go Down Moses. While Hamblin's work is undoubtedly a foundational contribution to the overall study of death in Faulkner's oeuvre, there is nevertheless a clear counter-argument to be made to his hypothesis about Faulkner's fiction. As such, the approach taken within my book remains unexplored in Faulkner scholarship. My study ventures to fill by acknowledging and elaborating upon a significant aspect of Faulkner's work that Faulkner himself actively ignored, denied, and downplayed throughout his entire career. In other words, my book hopes to make a clear distinction between Faulkner's belief in art as, in Hamblin's terms, the principal means by which man might defy time and death and achieve at least a measure of immortality, and the overwhelming desire for death that is exhibited by the principal characters in the major works that are studied within my book. Within the pages of my study, I argue that Faulkner's quest for literary immortality notwithstanding, to a range of his characters, death is not a profoundly negative state of annihilation. Instead, by being given a chance to raise their voices at the onset, or in Adi Bundren's case, in the aftermath of death, Faulkner's characters can find refuge beyond the wall of oblivion that Faulkner was long determined to leave a scratch upon with writing. In summary, William Faulkner and Mortality deliberately works against the well-entrenched theory of fiction that critics have long identified as being within Faulkner's work. That theory, saying no to death, has long dominated scholarly discussion of death in his fiction. But through uncovering two themes within his work, death and literary voice, that have long been explored in isolation but never in combination, my book, I hope, offers a new way of reading Faulkner. In doing so, my approach highlights an important distinction between Faulkner's need as an artist to achieve immortality and the wish that many of his own characters express for death. Thank you very much.